zayis, which is the minimum volume, which is considered eating, he's subject to malchus. So now, if a person goes and he is unaware it's Shabbos, and the halacha of writing, you're not permitted to write on Shabbos. If a person writes 2 letters, 2 characters, aleph beis, inadvertently on Shabbos, what's the halacha? Any negative command which carries the liability of kores or mises bezdin, one has to bring a chatos. So let's say a person writes multiple letters on Shabbos. Inadvertently, he thinks it's Sunday morning and he writes multiple letters. How many chatos is he subject to? Only 1. Because he violated inadvertently the same lav repeatedly, only 1 chatos. What about if he cooks and he writes and he reaps? He inadvertently, he has to bring 3 chatos. For every malacha that he violates, it's another inadvertency. It's another category of malacha. He has to bring another chatos. However, there's a little bit of a problem. Because you bring the chatos, you bring the sin offering for transgressing the losaset, the negative commandment. There's only 1 negative commandment on Shabbos. It says losas kol malocha. So even though losas malocha manifests itself in 39 applications, but factually, you should only have to bring 1 chatos. So from where do we know that although it's stated as 1 lav, we see each category as if another negative commandment was violated? It's not the same negative commandment violated repeatedly. So the Gemara, and that's what we rule, because the Torah goes and says you're not permitted to do melacha on Shabbos. 6 days your work should be done, 7th day not. Then the Torah goes and singles out lo svareish b'chol mashosechem. You should not kindle fire in your communities. Why is the Torah singling this out? So one opinion is, and we rule this like this opinion, that although it's stated as 1 negative commandment, but you see it as multiple negative commandments, that each category is seen as another classification, although each classification is seen as another negative commandment. And that's what the Torah is saying. Just as lo svaru eish is one of the losas kol malocha, and the Torah singles it out to say, and it's articulated as a separate negative commandment, identically every one of the classifications of creative activity within losas kol malocha should be seen as a separate negative commandment, and therefore one is subject or liable to multiple sin offerings to atone for every malacha, which is another category, as if they're stated as separate lavim, separate negative commandments. That's why the Torah goes and singles out lo svareish b'chol mashosechem. That's one opinion, and that's what Rashi cites the opinion. The second, yesh omer lechalik yotza. Lechalik means to divide the categories of creative activity as if they're separate malachos, as if they're separate. But the first opinion is lav yotzas, that although every one of the creative activities of Shabbos carry a liability of death penalty if you're forewarned, or kores if you're not forewarned, and chatos if it's inadvertent, for kindling, one is not subject to that more extreme level of penalty, and one does not have chatos. For kindling, one does. That's why the Torah is singling it out. This is different than all the other melachos of the 39 categories. For this, there is no liability of death penalty. As a result, there is no liability of chatos. It's only a lav. That's what's being singled out. I mean, so it's a very serious difference. Does it carry the death penalty? Are you liable for a chatos? Or no? It's a lesser melacha than the others, and therefore it's only a lav. That's lav yotzas, l'chalik yotzas. Now the question is, what's the rationale? Why should kindling be considered different category than all the other melachos? Now, what we derive from the Mishkan is what? A melacha to be a creative activity to be a violation, it has to be done in a creative context. It's called melechas machshavas asher Torah. What about a melacha which is done destructively? You destroy something. Let's say a tree does not need pruning. And you go and you prune the tree, which actually you're damaging the tree. It is one violation of planting. Here, this cutting of the branches is not enhancing the growth of the tree. So though when it enhances the growth, you're in violation of notea. That's a derivative of planting. It's enhancement. But here where the tree has been pruned and you go beyond that point, it's called you damaging the tree. As a result of that, there's no liability. Kindling, the fuel, you're burning the wood. Kindling is destructive. The objective of destructive is constructive. Right? You burn fuel to cook. So in terms of the result, the value of the burning of the fuel is a positive value. But the creative aspect is not within the fuel, it's within the result, the consequence of what the fuel is being utilized for. As a result of it, it has a characteristic, an element of mekalkel rather than misaken. Every other malacha is creative in its totality. Here, kindling is destructive for the fuel, although the objective is to affect something else positively. That's the reason why this malacha is seen differently than all the other 38 creative categories of malacha for that reason. Okay? Now, there's Tosis, we find that the Gemara says, how do you know you're not permitted to transport from public domain to private domain and private domain to public domain on Shabbos? So the Gemara says, quote, says that we find in Mishkan, the Levium, they transported the beams. When they would dismantle the Mishkan, or they would erect the Mishkan, the beams were transported on wagons. The wagons, in terms of what they were, in terms of height and dimension, they were Rishus HaYochid. The area outside of the wagons were Rishus HaRabim. So the Levium, they would transport the beams from Rishus HaRabim, and when they would load them on the wagon, they would be transporting from Rishus HaRabim to Rishus HaYochid. So that's how I know that you're not permitted to transport from Rishus HaRabim to Rishus HaYochid. And how do we know that you're not permitted to transport from Rishus HaYochid to Rishus HaRabim in the other direction? Because the Levium, when they would erect the Mishkan, they would unload the wagons and they would take the beams from the wagon, which is Rishus HaYochid, and bring them off the wagon, Rishus HaRabim. That's the Gemara. So Rabbeinu Tam asks a question. If you're telling me that the prohibition is transporting from domain to domain, which is public to private, says you're not permitted to transport from public to private, you're not permitted to transport from private to public, because the whole issue is going from domain to domain. So why does the Gemara have to say that we find the Levium, they took the beams from the Rishus HaRabim onto the wagons, and how do we know Rishus HaYochid, Rishus HaRabim? Because when they would unload the wagons, which the wagon is Rishus HaYochid, and bring the beam to Rishus HaRabim. It's understood. So Rabbeinu Tam says something very interesting. You find that transporting is different than any other malacha. Why? Any other category of malacha, it's this creativity to the malacha. Sewing, planting, dyeing, cutting something to an exact size, cooking, whatever it may be. When you transport something, in terms of the object is the same object. The only difference is its location. So in terms of accomplishment, you haven't accomplished anything. In terms of creativity, it's taking from point A to point B, or from domain A to domain B. So it's something, it has a new concept. It's what we call a chidush. It's something, a novel situation here. Whenever we present something which is novel, we say it's limited to the context which the Torah says it. Therefore, the Torah has to tell us, just as they took the beams from Rishus HaRabim to Rishus HaYochid, they took the beams from the wagon into Rishus HaRabim. Therefore, we have to speak about both sides of the equation. That's Rabbeinu Tam. So the way Rabbeinu Tam classifies the malacha of Hotzah or Hachnosa as a malacha grua, it's a deficient malacha. It's less of a malacha than all the others because it has no creative aspect to it. Havara, although it may be destructive in itself, but the objective of the burning, of the kindling, is for purpose, illumination. You put a wick, you light it in the oil is being consumed, but it's providing light. You burn fuel for cooking, the objective is, the result is creative. But in transporting, what are you doing? It's the same object, you're just taking it from one location to another. So it doesn't meet the profile of malacha, therefore I would think you should not be liable. Therefore the Torah has to tell us, in each situation because they took the beams off the wagon, on the wagon, or vice versa, that's why you're liable. Okay? So therefore, but it doesn't have the destructive aspect. So therefore, havora or hutzah, transporting domain to domain, everybody agrees. The liability is the death penalty. That's considered a bona fide malacha, which carries the chatos if it's done inadvertently. But havora, according to the opinion, in its essence, it's destructive. You're changing it, not constructively. The fuel itself is being destroyed. Therefore, according to this opinion, the Torah singles it out to tell us it doesn't have the same level of liability as all the other malachos for that reason. Okay? So that's why the Torah is singling out for that reason.
Okay, I'm just trying to